The president said he must personally be involved in selecting Iran's next leader, and that choosing the son of the late supreme leader is unacceptable to him. Quote, "They are wasting their time. Khamenei's son is a lightweight. I have to be involved in the appointment, just like Delcy Rodríguez in Venezuela. Khamenei's son is unacceptable to me. We want someone that will bring harmony and peace to Iran."
Let's bring in Axios Global Affairs correspondent Barak Ravid, who just spoke with President Trump to break that story. Barak, as we expect to hear an update from the defense secretary, today President Trump told you that he needs to be personally involved in selecting Iran's next leader, just as he was in Venezuela. What is his reasoning? What more did he say?
So first, one very interesting thing that he said is that he basically sort of confirmed the fact that the leading candidate at the moment to be Iran's next supreme leader is the former supreme leader's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. And Trump called Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, a lightweight, and said that it's unacceptable for him that he will be the next supreme leader of Iran. And Trump said, I want to be involved in picking the next leader of Iran, like I was involved in Venezuela. And one of the reasons that he gave for this is that he said, I don't want to have there somebody that will have the same policy as the former leader had, that will only get the US in 5 years to a place where it has to go again to war against Iran, because they will rebuild their nuclear facilities, they will rebuild their missile launchers. So I think that when Donald Trump says that he wants to get involved, I don't think he thinks that he will be able to point at somebody and say, okay, you're the next leader of Iran. But I think he definitely says that he wants the system in Iran to be very, very different than the one at the moment.
I want to get straight to CNN's chief international security correspondent, Nick Payton-Walsh, who is live in Tel Aviv. What do you make of those comments, Nick?
I think it's interesting because it potentially informs us as to one of the reasons, perhaps, that the process of selecting the successor to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been slow. There have been suggestions we might be seeing infighting internally, despite a lot of the publicity that was given around the succession plans Khamenei put in the event of his death. We are still day 5 now, not clear who is in charge of Iran. But I think there's also possibly here, particularly with the comparisons to Venezuela, a slight insight as to the president's grasp of how hard line a lot of what he's dealing with Iran indeed is towards the United States, or perhaps lack of grasp. It's a totally different situation to Venezuela, where he is clearly admitting here that they had a direct influence on the choice of Nicolás Maduro, the former president's deputy, to take over the job. It was a swift move, keeping the government in place. What we're dealing with here, though, is essentially appointing a hardline cleric in a position for leading an Islamic revolution. A lot of the fundamental original beliefs were resistant to the American presence in the region, and indeed to Israel here as well. So the concept that job of supreme leader can be one that the American president has a role in selecting, I think is somewhat complex. Certainly it will be very hard for many of the 88 senior clerics in the Assembly of Experts who have met twice, seemingly dodging Israeli airstrikes over past days. The results of those meetings as yet unclear. Very hard to imagine them accepting it. But still, here we have a slight glimmer of a political compromise, perhaps. And one of the interesting things President Trump said in that article is they didn't have to come back in 5 years from now and do this all over again. Now, the tone of that statement, to some degree, possibly suggests that now the president's mindset has gone from the kinetics of military action here, which still continue unabated, very aggressively and brutally inside of Iran, where this morning a human rights group based in the United States said the death toll had reached 1,100, and we've just heard of the 13th wave of Israeli strikes against targets inside the country now. That perhaps the president is talking about the possibility of finding a leader in Iran that they could ultimately do business with. It is ideologically something that's going to cause somersaults, total incompatibility to the nature of the Islamic revolution, the regime inside Iran. And so this is both something of a non-starter, but also at the same time, perhaps a suggestion that the president's mindset is thinking about compromise.
Explained only the way you can explain it, Nick Payton-Walsh. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And here at the table, we have some terrific reporters. David Sanger is one of them. So, David, there's so many ways to unpack this new statement from the president. First is one of the things that Nick said, which is that the president's comparison to what happened in Venezuela, which he does deem as a success, even though the Maduro regime is still there. Delcy Rodríguez, it was part of the Maduro regime, but they feel like, they're doing business with her. And making that comparison to Iran, which, as Nick just described, could not be more different for a multitude of reasons. And then the other part of what's interesting about the president's statement is, as we see the sort of evolution of the reasons for war, regime change has kind of fallen by the wayside, and now you're seeing the president bring that back into the conversation.
It's stunning on several fronts. So, first of all, when the Iranians hear this, the first thing they're going to think is 1953, when the United States helped organize a coup to make sure that the British could still have access to oil in Iran, and installed a leader, the Shah, who ultimately got overthrown in the 1979 revolution. So you have the possibility here of alienating some of the people who really want to see this government gone, but don't want the United States picking the leader. I think how we react when we hear about the possibility of foreign interference in our elections, right? Second problem here is the president's been talking about Venezuela as his model here. He said it to the Times in an interview on Sunday. That was the moment when he said he had 3 candidates in mind, and then later on said that many of them had been killed. But the fact of the matter is, as you just heard before from Nick, is the danger of false analogy here is huge. First of all, it's a country of 90 million people, so it's nearly 3 times the size of Venezuela. But the complexity of dealing with both the clerical leadership and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, you're not going to be able to keep them in place the way you could keep the Venezuelan government in place.
And that's really, really important, because what happened in 1979 and has been in place for 47 years is a government that is run by, and their North Star is their ideology and their faith, and their faith and the way that they see their faith, which is an extreme view of it for sure. And that is not something that happened in Venezuela, and that is hard for an American president to penetrate and say, okay, I want X or Y leader in there as part of the current mindset, versus the idea of just totally getting rid of the regime and somehow, maybe it's utopia, finding a way to get a more democratic leader in there.
Look, our experiments with regime change in the past and us controlling it have been difficult. We tried in Iraq with more than 100,000 troops on the ground. Here we don't want to have any troops on the ground and do it by remote control. So that's one problem, I think, with this. I think the second problem with it is that you've got sort of 3 major options here of how we may get a new government. One possibility is that people rise up, as the president suggested on Saturday, but they have no organization and no guns. That's a problem. The second is the best you might hope for would be sort of an Islamic State 2.0 that is a little bit less hard line and more amenable to dealing with the U.S. and more pragmatic, maybe on the nuclear program and so forth. That might be the best outcome. And then there's the big possibility that you get a more hardline government that actually goes out and shoots more people in the streets.
And then there's the question, many questions about sort of how we got here and what went into the president's decision making, which is still very relevant because of the way that they're kind of feeling their way on how this war is going and what constitutes an end. Caroline Leavitt yesterday at the briefing first said the president had a good feeling about it, that this was the right time. And then she said this.
The president had a feeling, again, based on fact, that Iran was going to strike the United States, was going to strike our assets in the region, and he made a determination to launch Operation Epic Fury based on all of those reasons.
Had a feeling, and then she said later, a feeling based on fact.
Right. Whatever that fact may have been that drove said feeling or feelings, plural, has not necessarily been conveyed in the briefings that have been given on Capitol Hill in a classified manner, at least as far as we have, the sources I've talked to that have been involved in those briefings, just making clear, we're not going to talk about classified information, but there was nothing specific that we saw that would back up an imminent threat to U.S. forces. I think that a couple of things can be true here at the same time, and it's important to take that into context. One, the opportunity itself with the strike, the joint strike with the Israelis to take out the leadership presented itself, was very real, was driven by U.S. intelligence. Two, Iran is at a weaker point right now than it has ever been over the course of the last several decades. At the same time, it was once again boosting its ballistic missile stocks or its attempts to reinforce its capability there. And the U.S. saw an opportunity at the same time where if Israel decided to strike unilaterally, U.S. forces would absolutely be targeted as a response. But none of those things necessarily precipitate an imminent threat in that exact moment. As to the feeling, I actually think that these things all connect with Barak's reporting, David's reporting on Venezuela. I've heard repeatedly, and at first didn't really take it that seriously, but that the run the president is on in foreign policy contributed heavily to the, hey, I'm hot, let's keep going, let's keep going. And I think the risk in that could probably fill up a history book on some level at some point, but just real quick, let me translate what MPW and David are trying to diplomatically analyze. It's not tethered to reality. Any comparative to Venezuela, their leadership, their types of government, the hemispheric location, any of that type of stuff. And I think that's right now where a lot of people are trying to grasp around for what the reality is.
Yeah, and this whole concept of his feeling is in part, I think, reacting to some great reporting that you had, David, and your colleagues about Trump's determination to cut through bureaucracy, reduce his advisors to a very small leak-proof few, and trust his instinct over intelligence briefings. And our colleague here at CNN, Adam Cankren, also had the following, talking about sort of perhaps why we got into this situation where there was a little bit of chaos on White House messaging. Trump officials in the lead up to the weekend strikes warned the president that striking Iran could generate unpredictable political repercussions, stressing that it was difficult to pinpoint how the offensive would play out over time. That's according to people familiar with the matter.